Chaps, welcome back to SJ MMA. Today we're talking about the ones that got away. I don't mean your girlfriend in year 11 who stood you up at prom and then left you for your best friend. That didn't happen to me, right? Just making that clear. Anyway, fuck me. Anyway, basically, right? The ones that got away in terms of MMA matchups. That's what we're focusing on for today's video. So, let's look at 5 of the most high profile matchups that for one reason or another we never saw. Let's start with the one that you probably first thought of when you saw the title. It might be on your screen already, I think it probably will be, knowing my editing skills. Khabib versus Tony. What makes this one so unique is not only the amount of times it was cancelled, but also the different stages of the 155-pound weight class both fighters were at different times of cancellations. They were scheduled as top rising contenders, as interim champion, undisputed unification kind of situation. They were scheduled to fight for the vacant title after Conor boxed Floyd. All over the place. One of the cancellations was down to a massive injury for Khabib that nearly ended his entire MMA career very, very early. Tony Ferguson famously tripped on a wire in the Fox UFC studio about a month out from their fight. And of course, some bloke in Asia thought it would be a good idea to eat a bat and start a worldwide pandemic that trapped Khabib in Russia. So, yeah. It very much felt like there may have been some voodoo nonsense going on in the background there, and for some reason the universe never wanted that fight, even though us fans definitely did. And at the time, I always backed Tony Ferguson. I felt like he was the nightmare matchup for Khabib at all points of their careers, regardless of if it was early or the last time it was scheduled, which would have been UFC 249. I felt like Tony was the guy to beat him, I really did. Mainly because prime Tony Ferguson was one of the most mythical of all mythical fighters that we've ever seen. But as time went on, then we've seen his decline, which if you look at the way Tony was fighting, the way he would take so much damage, the unorthodoxness of how he both trained and fought, a decline was kind of always going to happen. But when you look at it with your 2024 vision goggles on, Khabib would have beaten Tony Ferguson. Because as much as the unorthodox nature was enough to catch out some top lightweights, like Lee and Anthony Pettis, and loads of others, RDA is another example, great performance in Mexico City, that one. Khabib was just so fundamentally strong and so physically strong, he would have just overpowered him, I think. Which is a shame, because I really would have loved to have seen what would have happened. We all would have done. That's the one that got away, the main one. So I thought I'd start with it. I just had it in my head that even if Khabib managed to take down Tony Ferguson, which he probably would have done, he would have used those nasty elbows off the bottom, he would have been scrappy in the scramble, made his way back up and just kind of cut Khabib open over time. Worn him out over 5 rounds and got a late stop. Now, as you think about it logically, Khabib would have had far too much, to be honest. He may have even cracked him on the feet. If you can hit a relatively prime Conor McGregor on the feet and hurt him, you can hurt a prime Tony Ferguson. So, it's one of those where, in hindsight, Khabib would have won, but nonetheless, we should have seen it and we never did, which is a real shame. We're going to keep in the lightweight division, and we are going to talk about a fight that did not happen for the notorious Mr. Conor McGregor. Now, after UFC 194, where he knocked out Aldo in 13 seconds, and before he left the sport to box Floyd Mayweather, there was the time in between where he had the 2 Diaz fights, and he won the lightweight title against Eddie Alvarez at Madison Square Garden. We know that, but UFC 196's original headliner was McGregor against then lightweight champion RDA. One of the Irishman's most notorious lines on the microphone was "Red Panty Night," and he said that to Rafael dos Anjos in a press conference just after their UFC 196 bout was officially announced. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. RDA had to pull out with, I think it was a knee injury, I believe it was, and the rest is history. They never turned up in each other's bracket again, and at this point in their careers, they never will. So, yeah, this one's definitely gone. But how would it have actually played out if it happened? Even though he was the sitting, reigning, and, well, he never actually defended the title, but he was the sitting and reigning UFC lightweight champion, RDA had still had a tumultuous time up to that point. Khabib had bashed him up over 3 rounds. I remember him getting brutally stopped by Jeremy Stephens early on in his UFC career as well. But he did a number on who was then seen as the future of the division, Anthony Pettis, which was a big shock. I remember watching that fight as a 14-year-old kid. I stayed up till like 3, 4 a.m. obviously, and I was all over this Anthony Pettis hype train. That was kind of constructed by the UFC, which was smart. He was marketable, he was on a cereal box as well. I begged my parents to buy me one of those Anthony Pettis cereal boxes from the US. It never happened, and literally before they were even released, he lost to RDA, so that went well, didn't it? I remember leading in, the main narratives were around the size of RDA, and the jiu-jitsu abilities of RDA. And if you look at what happened against Nate Diaz, which is the fight that actually went down on that day, he struggled with the fact that Nate was bigger than him, and he got submitted. So if you kind of put 2 and 2 together, you would naturally think that RDA would have had a real sniff in that fight. Nah. I don't think so. Especially back then, in his absolute pomp, Conor McGregor was such a sniper. He was the definition of a sharpshooter within MMA. And the reason why Diaz was able to, in the rematch, survive 5 rounds, and in the first fight, actually get to a point where he could tire Conor out and then get him down and submit him, was you'd need a 4x4 lorry to knock that dude over. RDA goes over slightly easier. Especially back then, he still had a decent chin, but I think it would have gone quite similar to the Eddie Alvarez fight that we saw at UFC 205. It would have been even easier for Conor, I think, to find those openings against another southpaw. If he hit RDA with the shots he was hitting Diaz with, RDA would have gone down, I believe, in the first sort of 5-8 minutes. So I think, regardless of if that happened at UFC 196, Conor McGregor would have still been a simultaneous 2-weight world champion, and he would have knocked RDA out relatively early. Our third cancelled fight on this list is going back a bit further into the archives of MMA, of the UFC in particular, of course. UFC 151, which never actually happened. It was the first pay-per-view that was cancelled in the promotion's history, and it was because the main event of Jon Jones versus Dan Henderson fell off in incredibly unforeseen and crazy circumstances. I might make a full video on that at some point because it's very interesting. If you know how that went down, then you know how crazy it was. To kind of simplify it, for those of you who don't know, basically Henderson tore his MCL about 3 weeks out from the fight. He didn't train another minute. Tried to make the day. It got to, I think it was 5 or 6 days out. He couldn't. He called the UFC. He said, I'm out of the fight. The UFC then tried desperately to find a late notice replacement. Jones turned down Chael Sonnen, which is how I really learned about it because I loved Chael at the time. And it really did cause a rift between Jones and Dana after Dana flat out blamed Jones and especially his head coach at Jackson Wink, Greg Jackson, for the reason why the event got cancelled. It was messy. But what would have happened if UFC 51 actually took place? Right, lads, you have to look at this one with your early 2010s goggles on, okay? Because at that time, obviously, Jones was still in his mid-20s, I believe. He'd already beaten a who's who of light heavyweights. And Dan Henderson had been a bit up and down with the UFC. Won a tournament within the promotion early on in his MMA career. I think it was UFC 17. Left the promotion, went to Pride. He did great things over there, beat Wanderlei Silva. Came back to the UFC, lost a middleweight title fight against Anderson Silva, went to Strikeforce, won their title, and then when Strikeforce absorbed back into the UFC, he had a great fight with Shogun Rua, and then we get to his supposed fight with Jon Jones. The aura of Mr. Jon Jones was already built by that point. This was kind of before he really started to be known as this coke-sniffing, cheating, PED-taking bastard, basically. This was a bit before that, but kind of not that far before we kind of started to get the sense that this new, young, Nike-sponsored glittering world champion wasn't as light and bright as he seemed. But we also knew, even back then, that he was bloody good. And if you listen to Jon Jones' interviews around the Rampage Jackson fight, he said he was petrified of him. He was petrified of the punch power. He was petrified of the idea of getting chinned, basically. Lucky for him, he's always had a good chin. But when I look at Dan Henderson, especially then, I mean, granted he was late 30s, early 40s by that point anyway, but he was still kind of in his prime, I would say, which is crazy. Because he'd already had a lifetime of wrestling and fighting, and he was still pretty much the Hendo that we know and love even then. So that overhand right, because the thing with Jon Jones is, and if you even watch his most recent fight with Stipe, he's very good at like using his height and his frame. He's really good at kind of circling out and almost using the lead hand as a post. Dan Henderson is very good at stepping through things like that and winging that big H-bomb over the top. To try and visualise what I'm trying to say here, beautiful people, I don't know if you guys watched AJ against Daniel Dubois at Wembley earlier this year, but in the first round when AJ was trying to use his jab and almost kind of like post and move backwards, and then Dubois smacked him over the top with that overhand right, I could have seen Henderson doing a similar thing to Jones, but I will say, as much as he does post, Jones is very good at keeping his chin safe. So, not sure if it's particularly a great comparison, but I only use that example to try and give you an idea of what I'm trying to visualise for you here. With that being said, as much as Henderson's got a brilliant wrestling base, he was a superb young wrestler and he used it in his MMA career at times, even though he did kind of strike more than he grappled, especially later on. winging that legendary H-bomb over the top of a posted Jones jab was probably his only way to win that fight. Jones had age on him, he had versatility, he could hurt you in many different ways, finish you anywhere, and I think he would have done. Probably would have had to survive danger. Henderson may have maybe connected once and hurt him. At that point we hadn't really seen Jones in any trouble, so that could have been quite cool. But yeah, obviously, yeah. I think it would have been quite an easy one for Jones by the end, but Henderson would have been dangerous to him, solely because of that. And probably only because of that. I can't think of any other way Henderson could have done anything to Jones apart from that. But if he'd have landed it perfectly while he was fresh, who knows. Number 4, UFC 230 was supposed to feature a 5-round lightweight bout between Dustin Poirier and Nate Diaz. Again, you've got to use those goggles, people. 2018 goggles would have told you that Dustin Poirier was on the way to becoming a massive star in the UFC, but he wasn't there yet. He was slowly building kind of a reputation and a resume after moving up to lightweight from featherweight a couple of years earlier, and we hadn't seen Diaz since he fought Conor, and there was intrigue about him coming back. This would have been brilliant to see, especially at that point. Now, if this fight was announced, let's say, tomorrow, to be happening in early 2025, the odds would be like minus 1100 in favour of Poirier. Of course, he'd be a huge favourite, but back then, he wasn't. And for good reason, because Diaz put on, in my opinion, the performance of his career against Michael Johnson, and then rose up straight into the stratosphere by beating the then unbeatable Conor McGregor. It would have been wonderful to see. Do I think that Diaz would have been able to use that hype and that sort of newfound fame and almost maybe a belief in himself to beat a rising Dustin Poirier? I don't think so. The way I looked at it then and the way I still look at it now, 6 years later, is how did Nate Diaz beat Conor McGregor? He outworked him. You could say, and you could say this, he broke him. You can't break Dustin Poirier. Nobody has ever broken Dustin Poirier. He's been beat, never ever been broken. The only time was psychologically by Conor at UFC 178, but that wasn't in the octagon. He was in his mind before they even got in there. In terms of actually physically breaking him down, you can't really do that to Poirier. If you watch his fights with arguably the two best lightweights of all time in Islam and Khabib at UFC 242 and 302, if he was going to break, literally, systematically, physically break down, one of those two guys, if not both of them, would have done it. Nate Diaz with his sloppy 1-2s and his chin up in the air and his lanky fatness wouldn't have got anywhere near breaking Poirier. And come the end of the fight, he would have pieced him up, I believe. So I think Poirier would have definitively beat Nate Diaz over 5 rounds. And I would like to finish with what would have been on UFC 269's main card in December of 2021. The grudge match that was a long time in the making, Leon Edwards and Jorge Masvidal. The backstory was incredibly well documented. Long story short, the main event of UFC London in 2019, Jorge Masvidal came back after a layoff and knocked out Darren Till in a shocker. Leon Edwards won the co-main event against Gunnar Nelson. Backstage there was that 3-piece in the soda kind of punch out thing, and yeah, they hated each other from there, unsurprisingly so, and this was supposed to settle it. Obviously, in between that moment and UFC 269, Jorge went on to have a brilliant rest of 2019 as well, with the flying knee over Ben Askren and the BMF title over Nate Diaz. Leon Edwards beat Nate himself in that time. As both a massive supporter of UK-based fighters and a big Masvidal fan, I was very bloody conflicted when this one was announced, but at the time, I led Masvidal, because I just think the way that Masvidal kind of pieces you up and the way Leon tries to piece you up, there's so much more spite in Masvidal. I've always appreciated the way that he's kind of moulded the natural street brawler within him into kind of actually good technical fundamentals of MMA striking. I love the blend he has going on there. And I think Leon, I still think this now about Leon, in a scrap, Leon fades. In a high level kind of technical, mainly kickboxing fight, there's not a welterweight on the planet that can beat Leon Edwards. In a scrap, which I think it would have been, mainly because I don't think Masvidal would have allowed it to be anything else, I really do believe that Masvidal would have won. And if he had have beaten Leon Edwards, who knows where he'd be now. I mean, obviously, he had a big old decline after his Usman fights. He obviously got chinned by Usman at UFC 261. This fight broke down. He went on to fight Colby Covington instead, not long into 2022. UFC 272, I believe that was. And Leon went on to become world champion by head-kicking Kamaru Usman, as we know. So, it's a shame we never saw this, but no, if it happened, I would have backed Masvidal. I really would have done. It's a real cliche, people, but styles do, have done, and always will make fights. It doesn't matter who you are, MMA math does not work. It doesn't work like that. It's all about the individual matchups. But anyway, on that note, that wraps us up for today's video. If there's any fights that I missed out, let me know down below. Let me know how you think some of these fights would have played out if they'd have happened. And take care.